There's something that happens this time of year, to some of us, to me. Surrounded by sights and sounds that tell me to celebrate, it's the most wonderful time of year, but in my heart, it's just winter. It's like the isolation you feel when you're playing hide and seek, and no one ever finds you, and you're not even sure if they're still looking. I long for God. I long to know what it's like to feel His presence, to feel joy, to feel hope. But what if this path is more than how I feel? What if it's not about being forgotten, but it's about being found? What if the way back to joy and hope is actually seeking me out? What if it's closer than I think?
If you were to ever find yourself in Manhattan, you might go to what's now known as the 9/11 tribute or memorial. And if you were to do that, you might see that a lot of money was spent, time and effort put together to build museums, to celebrate memories, to mourn the loss. And rightfully so. It was a catastrophic day. But if you were to meander just a little bit to the east of where the Twin Towers once stood, you would see there a small little church chapel. Now, I say all of this with the belief that maybe just one day, you might be able to go to Manhattan again. We'll see. But if you did, you should go check out this little church chapel. It's called St. Paul's Chapel of Trinity Church. It's not actually Trinity Church, but it is a chapel that is owned by Trinity Church. Trinity Church is pretty famous because it's a church right on the edge of Wall Street. And if you watched or listened to Hamilton at all, it's referenced in the musical Hamilton because it's the church where Alexander Hamilton attended and then is buried. You can find his grave there. But they have this little chapel just up to the north of Wall Street where Trinity Church actually is. And this little chapel has an incredible history, completely intertwined and intermingled with American history. It's just unbelievably fascinating. First of all, it had already been erected by 1776, and so when Manhattan burned on fire because the British troops lit it on fire, this church had already been built and somehow withstood the Great Fire of 1776. In fact, it was intact and still functioning so that when George Washington was inaugurated as our first president, there was no such thing as Washington, D.C. at the time. He was inaugurated in Manhattan. And upon being inaugurated as our first president, he went to this little chapel to pray and to worship as soon as he was inaugurated. So this little building has been around for a long, long time. And it was there and still functioning on September 11th, 2001. Interestingly enough, there's a big tree right outside of it. And somehow, as I understand it, because of this big, strong tree with deep roots, when there was rubble and chaos all across the blocks of Manhattan the day the planes hit the towers, well, so much of the buildings and businesses were being hit by falling rubble. This church withstood all of that and did not crumble whatsoever. In fact, it stood out as one of the few buildings and one of the smallest buildings that did not take damage on that day. And so that church immediately sprung into action on the other side of the cataclysmic events of the morning. They opened up their building and began allowing first responders to rest, food to be served to people who came down and volunteered, a place where doctors and nurses could set up triage. In the midst of chaos and pain and hurt, the church there recognized immediately that its place was to bring hope to an utterly hopeless place and circumstance. In so many ways, I think this is what the church does well. It practices its worship of God in preparation so that when hell meets earth, The church has a different story to tell in the midst of it. There was no joy to be had on September 11th, but a community that centered itself around the joy that Christ brings allowed itself to exude a different story, a different peace and patience, kindness, love, and joy than what most other organizations were able to feel in that moment. They were prepared when hell met earth in order to demonstrate what a taste of heaven could be like. The church is meant to be a joyous people, not tied to circumstances of what's going on around us, but to be a different sort of testimony when the world is telling a different sort of story. And so today we're going to talk about joy. It's that part of Advent. This week, every single year, we talk about joy in the third week of Advent, 2 Sundays before Christmas. And most years, this is a fairly awkward sermon to preach. I look out on a congregation that's busy going from party to party, purchasing gift after gift, receiving gift after gift, and saying to a people who are joyed out, have some joy. We're usually pretty happy in December, even though it's an exhausting time of year, but this year is different. This year, joy isn't easily manufactured with a busy schedule, another party, another get-together. In fact, joy seems to be more expensive than it has ever been before. Harder to find, harder to cultivate, harder to name. And if you want proof that I think that is true, load up your social media accounts. I've read them. Joy doesn't seem to be the theme on Facebook in 2020. So when we talk about joy, hopefully we're not simply talking about happiness. I want to carry that theme throughout this entire sermon today, to talk about the difference between joy and happiness. Happiness, it seems to me, is dependent on circumstance. Things need to be going well. There needs to be cash in your bank account. You need to be healthy. People around you need to be positive influences. The economy needs to be humming. You need to be getting promoted at work. Your kids need to be doing well in school and on the ball field. Happiness demands circumstances. Joy is much different. I think joy is radically different because joy can emerge out of us when circumstances are poor. In a year like 2020, when we can name all of the things wrong with the world, economic struggle, food lines, unemployment, politicians winning or losing depending on your perspective, coronavirus, shutdowns, no traveling. Should I meet with my parents? Should I not, to protect them? There are so many circumstances fighting against us in our world today. Joy doesn't need any of them to break our way. Joy emerges from the inside. It's a God-given gift. It's a state of being, a state of mind, a state of being in relationship with God. When God is at work in our lives, we can exude joy when the rest of the culture is moving in the exact opposite direction. Despair and sadness are cheap and omnipresent in a world like we live in today. Joy acts differently, behaves differently in the face of all of that evidence. And so when we talk about joy today, we're turned by the lectionary, by our devotional, by what we're doing in order to study leading up to Christmas. We're given this text that we're going to read today in Isaiah chapter 61. And when I first read this, I thought, well, this isn't a very fair sermon for me to have to preach in 2020. But here's the thing. This prophetic word that God gives to Isaiah that comes in chapter 61 finds the Israelites in a season of despair, not unlike our season of despair. They have returned in exile to find a temple in desolation and rubble. Their homes and old neighborhoods unfunctioning. The treasury empty. The king is foreign and not local. They have very little control out of their own lives, and they're looking for hope anywhere they can find it. And Isaiah comes as a prophet with these words that we're going to read today, right into a desperate situation like we find ourselves in today. So I'm going to invite you, if you would, to read Isaiah chapter 61 with me. It's 11 verses. We're going to read them all together. And I'd like to invite you to stand with me as we read the word of the Lord. Starting with verse 1, the Spirit of the Lord, sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of the spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of their splendor. They will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated, and they will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. Strangers will shepherd your flocks. Foreigners will work your fields and vineyards, and you will be called priests of the Lord. You will be named ministers of our God. You will feed on the wealth of nations, and in their riches you will boast. Instead of your shame, you will receive a double portion. Instead of disgrace, you will rejoice in your inheritance. And so you will inherit a double portion of your land, and everlasting joy will be yours. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. In my faithfulness, I will reward my people and make an everlasting covenant with them. Their descendants will be known among the nations and their offspring among the peoples. All who see them will acknowledge that they are a people the Lord has blessed. I delight gratefully in the Lord. My soul rejoices in my God, for he has clothed me with garments of salvation and arrayed me in a robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom adorns his head like a priest, and as brides adorn herself with her jewels. For as the soil makes the sprout come up, and the garden causes the seeds to grow, so the sovereign Lord will make righteousness and praise spring up before all nations. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. This word comes to a weary, distraught, broken, impoverished people. We recognize their story because we are struggling in ways that we don't usually get to read this text with lens similar to. And this word comes as a prophetic word. This is not their reality. When this word of prophecy comes, their situation and their circumstance doesn't change. But they are reminded of a God at work in their midst who wants to turn their sorrow, brokenness, sadness into joy. There's that little passage right in the middle in verse 7 that uses the word instead. Instead of your experience, I will do this. Instead of what you have, I will do this. God is in the business of turning circumstances upside down. And this circumstance that he has about turning upside down is radical. It's so radical, in fact, that people struggle to accept it. This idea begins with a forgiveness that is indescribable and unimaginable. I know it's unimaginable because it's tangible, and the people of Israel deeply struggled with it. This text, I don't know if you're reading from the NIV or what yours says, but mine says right above chapter 61, the year of the Lord's favor. That's what this is titled as, which seems to me to be a pretty strange text to read in 2020. I have not heard anyone call 2020 the year of the Lord's favor. Yeah, grumble, grumble, giggle, giggle, right? But that's not really what's happening here, what's being talked about here. What's being talked about here is a concept called Jubilee. And the Jubilee was understood in in Israel as the year of the Lord's favor. And here's the problem with the year of Jubilee. It's a pretty radical concept that history has never, ever recorded being followed. And here's the problem with that, once you get into that, is that if you were to read the book of Leviticus, I know many of you have been reading that devotionally this week, there is, in the wilderness, the people of God are in the wilderness. God is giving them the law and telling them who they're going to be when they establish themselves in the land that God has promised for them. And in this is all sorts of laws. We often think of the laws of the Old Testament as moral type of things. But there's economic structures in the law as well. And in Leviticus chapter 25, there are 4 basic economic structures in Leviticus that are talked about. The first 3, Israel followed fairly well, or at least talked about and took seriously as important things that they were going to do. The first 3 issues of economic law was tithing, that the people of God would set apart 10% of their income, and they would give it to their synagogue or temple to help pay for the priests to do the work of priests. Tithing, 10% of their income, and this was talked about all the time in ancient Israel and practiced as well. The second economic structure was the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is the idea that you would work hard for 6 days and rest on the 7th day. This is an economic issue because the rest of the world was working 7 days a week. If a foreigner came in contact with a Jewish person and saw them sitting around on the 7th day of the week, they would call them lazy, because there was productivity to be had in 7 days a week. And if you were working 7 days a week, you were more productive, which gave you more wealth. This idea that you would rest and have something like a weekend was a radical concept in the ancient world, originally practiced only by the Jews. This idea of rest was an economic concern that the people took upon themselves and took it fairly seriously in Israel. The third was gleaning. The idea of gleaning was an agrarian concept where the Jews would have a field that they would plant, and they would leave the outer rows of their planting, and especially their corners, unharvested, so that foreigners, immigrants, impoverished people could come to the edge of someone's crops and take crops for themselves so that they could be fed. This was a further risk of someone's own personal wealth. These 3 things tacked on one after another, you could begin to see someone who was a landowner could be in danger of losing a substantial amount of their possible profit line any given year by giving 10% away, leaving the outside of their crops for foreigners and immigrants to take, and to not work one of the 7 days a week. And as risky as all of this is, Israel bought in, and they did this. Not perfectly, mistakes were made, people fell short, but they took this seriously. The 4th economic concept in Leviticus was Jubilee. You can read all about it in Leviticus chapter 25, if you can find Leviticus in your Bible. That's just a joke. Leviticus is really interesting if you have eyes to see it. It really is. It's also cumbersome, I get it. But in the 25th chapter of Leviticus, Jubilee is talked about, and the basic concept of it is this, is that you would plant for 6 years, and you would reap harvest for 6 years. And then on the 7th year, you would not plant so that the land could have its Sabbath rest. And that would match our weekly rhythm as people as well. This makes a whole lot of sense because fertilizer isn't what it was, right? And so the land couldn't just be sapped for its nutrients year upon year upon year without decimating the land. It makes perfect sense that you would leave this be every 7th year so that the land could recover. And so you would do that 7 years, then you'd do it 7 years again, then you'd do it 7 years again. 7 times 7, you know in the Old Testament that 7 is an important number. It means completion or wholeness. 7 is talked about all the time. This rhythm of 7 was supposed to be very important in Israel. 6 years of planting, 7th year off. Do that cycle 7 times, and then on the 7 times 7 is 49 for those of you who struggle with math. Then on the 50th year was to be the year of Jubilee. There was a trumpet called a Jubilee or something like that. They would blow it on the first day, and the year would be marked, the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, by undoing everything that had been done in the 49 years before. If you lost your land, it was returned to you. If you were charged with a crime and sent to jail, you were set free. If you owed a debt to someone, it was forgiven. It was an economic redo every 50 years. Now, you could imagine if you were deeply in debt and had a warrant out for your arrest, the year of Jubilee would be very good news. Very good news. You could also imagine that if you had had a good couple of years in business, you had accumulated good debt, and you had added to your property, the year of Jubilee might be very bad news. But if there's anything that you and I both know about politics, it's that people who don't have money, don't have prestige, also don't have political power. And so the people for who this would be very good news never got this good news to come to them because the people who had more power. And so throughout the history of Israel, there is no evidence that Jubilee was ever actually followed in the way that the law told them it had to be followed. And so this year of the Lord, as it was called, was never properly celebrated. And this theme of it coming, that one day the Lord would institute it and make all things right, was a theme that weaves its way into the scriptures in really, really interesting ways. For example, I'm going to name another really exciting book of the Bible for you, 2 Chronicles. We've been reading that devotionally this week. 2 Chronicles is a weird book, man. It's just like, this king did this, he was really bad at it, then his son became king, he was really bad at it too. Let me tell you how bad he was at it. I mean, that's really what 2 Chronicles is like. But at the very end of it, the very end of 2 Chronicles, is the narration of the exile coming. Babylon sacks Israel, sacks Jerusalem, the temple is laid waste, and the best and the brightest and the youngest and the strongest are taken out and led into exile in Babylon. And there's this little line that's inserted right in the bottom of 2 Chronicles that says that one of the consequences of exile was that the land finally had its Sabbath rest, which is a reference to the fact that Israel wasn't doing what they were supposed to do, letting the land lay fallow and trusting that God would feed them during that time. They were abusing even the land that God had given them. And so there's always these little hints, if you have eyes to see them, that there's this real frustration that God seems to have that Jubilee would never be celebrated. And so now on the other side of all of this frustration between God and people, the people are led back into a decimated land, city. They have nothing. They have no power. They don't really seem to be able to see a future for themselves, because if they wanted to just clean up, rebuild houses, rebuild the temple, how are they going to do that with an empty treasury? How are they going to do that without their own king? How are they going to do that without an army? How are they going to do that? They have no money, power, very little imagination. They've just got their land back and everything is destroyed. And into that decimation and despair, the prophet comes one more time talking about the year of the Lord. And the word that the sovereign Lord has is the word the sovereign Lord has had always for his people. It's a word of forgiveness. It's a word of restoration. It's a word of hope. And again, when the people hear it in their halves, when people have sinned against them and have been put in jail, they deserve it. When I have money, I don't want to give it back. But right now, they're the people on the negative side of the ledger. They're the people who are owed to. They're the people who fall short. They're the people who have a deficit of joy, hope, peace, and love. Their ledgers are in the negative right now. And they turn to God, and God says, the year of the Lord is coming. And when you're the person with the negative ledger, this is good news. God is saying all of the sins of your past that led to this desolation are going to be forgiven, for the year of the Lord is here. All the mistakes you have made, all the things that cause you to deserve prison, financial ruin, all the things that have caused you to seemingly deserve this world that is laid bare and broken, all the things you have done to cause this situation that you have ended up in, it's all forgiven. The year of the Lord is coming. It's going to be made right. And then he starts building this vision through Isaiah chapter 62 for joy. That out of this rubble there will be sprouts of joy. And the people around the world will look upon you and they will see that my righteousness and joy is being birthed out of you. Now that is a wild thing for a prophet to say to a bunch of poor people without homes, without a temple, without a king, without anything that makes you look great in the way the world works. And God is saying it's out of this situation that forgiveness and restoration and hope is coming, and the world will see in you that instead of the despair they think you should have, that out of my people, joy and righteousness will sprout up. This is such good news to a people who have no good news otherwise. Sometimes when we're the people of God, if there's anything that I think when I read the story of the people of God is that being the people of God is hard. It's not easy. God doesn't ask easy things out of his people. He gives us visions of good things, but he doesn't ask for easy things out of us. He's asking them to look around their situation and to become a people where joy sprouts up out of them. That's tough. That's a hard thing to ask. It's not simple, it's not easy, there's no quick fix, there's no fad, there's no way to get from desolation to joy that's easy. No DIY projects, no 5 steps to success. In order to find joy out of this despair, it's going to be hard work. And yet, they're giving a promise by the everlasting God that God sees their situation, their brokenheartedness, their captivity, their darkness, their sin, and God is saying, it's all forgiven. It's all wiped clean. The past is the past, and the future is one where you are all forgiven. This is the sort of work that God does in our lives. He looks at the ledgers that we have created, the bad deals we've made, the sins we've committed, the way we've talked to each other, the way we've treated our neighbor. He looks upon it all, and when the day of the Lord comes, we're forgiven. The past is the past. It's wiped away clean, and we are given a new state to be in with God. And it's out of this that we're given the opportunity to become a joyous people. It's out of the past being wiped away. It's out of forgiven being given to us as a gift that is unmerited and undeserved that joy begins to sprout up. You see, one of the things that I struggle with so much about the way we are wound as a Christian people today is that we don't seem to recognize the radical work that God has done in this world on our behalf. We seem to minimize it in such ways that not even that is enough to bring joy into our lives. That God himself showed up into a world that is keeping score, and everyone seems to be losing, and no one is willing to forgive. And God, the one who is most wronged of all, shows up as Jesus Christ, proclaims the year of the Lord favor, and says to people like you and me, you are forgiven. The ledger is wiped clean. And we still harbor bitterness, anger, and frustration at the circumstances of the world we live in. If we truly recognized the power of this Jubilee concept in tangible and spiritual ways, that we could be a forgiver and the forgiven, we might live completely differently. God is giving us a vision here, a pathway towards joy, and we're still waiting for our circumstances to get in order to be even happy. You see, happiness and joy are two very different things. I think we, even us Christian people, chase happiness as if it's a hit of drug that we are addicted to. We want our circumstances to be in order, and we pray and we pray and we pray to get better circumstances. But God has gifted us with all we need to have joy. You see, joy and happiness are very different. Joy exists. Happiness reacts. Joy embraces peace and contentment. It's waiting to be discovered. Happiness comes and goes blithely along the way. Joy is profound and it's scriptural. Don't worry, rejoice. Happiness is a balm. Don't worry, be happy. Joy is an inner feeling. Happiness is an outward expression. Joy endures hardship and trials and connects with meaning and purpose. Joy is cultivated and entrenched. Happiness is just of the moment. Joy is a choice, a practice, a behavior. It's intentional and deliberate. Happiness comes and goes. One realizes that he or she is joyful. One is just aware that they are happy. Joy is a central characteristic of the Christian life. It's central. When God sows his seed, joy is one of the fruits that is supposed to sprout. And yet, I made light, I made jokes of our social media earlier, but bring it up. Look at your account. Read your tweets. Look at those around you who are Christian people. God is planting joy within us, but we don't seem to be bearing that fruit. It's not a word that comes readily to the mind of the culture around us when they're describing Christian people. We don't seem to be testifying to lives of joy, when joy should be a natural outcome of a life who's marked by debts being wiped clean and forgiven. And the destiny of darkness and death and hell is being taken away and replaced with one of glory and light and hope and a future. And yet we struggle to exude joy because we're still looking for circumstances to get in order. This idea of the year of the Lord's favor becomes extra interesting because this text in Isaiah chapter 61 is quoted by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. You see, if you know how a thesis statement works, it's basically a short little description of all that's going to come in the book after it. And this quotation in Luke chapter 4 is like a thesis statement for the whole book of Luke. Jesus comes to a world and a people who still can't quite grasp Jubilee. They can't receive forgiveness and then give it away. They can't see that their slate is wiped clean and then wipe the slates clean of those around them. Jesus shows up to finally declare the year of the Lord's favor in his embodiment as man on earth with us. And Jesus comes on the scene and he goes out into the wilderness for 40 days and he's tested by Satan, and he comes out on the other side of that having survived the temptation, and he goes to church, his local synagogue in chapter 4. And when he gets there, he finds out that he's the reader for the day. And so they hand him a scroll and he walks up to the front. He rolls open the scroll and his reading is exactly this, Isaiah 61. And he reads the text that he has come to release the prisoner, to let the blind see, to bring forgiveness to those who are accused, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he rolls the scroll back up and he goes and he sits down and he says, "The words have been fulfilled in your hearing of this today." And then he goes about doing exactly these things. This is exactly what Jesus does, especially in the Gospel of Luke. You may not want to go home and read Leviticus or 2 Chronicles, but go check out Luke. That's an easier read. It's a lot of fun. But he goes about doing this. He finds blind people and he makes them see. He finds people who are in prison. He gives them hope and invites them to be broken free and set free from their captivity. And he proclaims the year of the Lord's favor, the possibility of Jubilee and upsetting of the systems of this world over and over and over to give us a new imagination of what life can look like as the forgiven who forgive. And the people who encounter this radical grace that Jesus embodies, that God's vision was given to Moses and the prophet Isaiah, the people's outcome is joy when they find this disposition from Jesus. We're meant to be a people of joy. But how do we get there? It's not easy and it certainly takes work. But it seems to me one of the things that ties this all together is that forgiveness is key to joy. Recognizing that we're forgiven and then forgiving as well. How can we be joyous if we're holding grudges against people all around us? Who are the people in our lives that we need to forgive because our unforgiveness is cramping the joy that God is trying to sprout within us? Are we mad or harboring anger or resentment at our parents, at elected officials, our children, friends, siblings? Maybe it's something small. Maybe you just resent some sort of financial issue in your life. Maybe you resent the way your wife or husband talked to you this morning. But it's hard to be joyous when we're so resentful. And the reason we're supposed to be joyful is because we've been forgiven. Such little things can cramp the sort of fruit that God is trying to build and grow in our lives. And if joy is one of them, are we cramping it out by our inability to receive God's forgiveness and then pass it on? I would love to see us as a Christian people embody the radical forgiveness of God and then be a testimony of the possibilities of joy for the sake of a world that is not joyous. We're going to sing a final song together. As they all come out, I invite you to wrestle as you sing with what's stamping out your joy. Is it lack of forgiveness? Is it anger? Is it something else? God is trying to build us to be a joyous people. What's the barrier between you and the work that God is trying to do in your life? Confess it before Him today and ask Him to fill those spaces with His joy. Would you join me and stand as we worship together?